February 8th. I would like to make a statement before we go any further due to a misunderstanding, perhaps on my part. The committee will vote to pay for the NCTV costs associated with tonight's meeting at the next regularly scheduled meeting. And I publicly am making a statement that I did not write a check yet. So that's even better. So to start out, I'd like everybody to understand this is a workshop meeting, which is a little different than our regular meetings. It's a meeting in public, but not a public meeting. So yelling questions at me, throwing pencils to get my attention really won't work. It's designed to allow the school committee to get informed about issues, in this case around PFAS and the turf fields. The school committee is not going to make a decision tonight. It's not going to take any votes tonight. Decisions on the master plan are going to come up at town meeting, and that's where the final decisions will be made. The questions will be some that were developed earlier and some from the school committee. Those of you that have other questions, please fill out index cards and get them down to us. Superintendent Hallett said she will deal with them. Remember, this is designed for school committee education, but also as collateral education for our citizens. Those are the ground rules, everybody. I'd like to have a approval of the agenda.
So moved. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. We are going to adjourn into a workshop session. The purpose of the meeting is for the school committee members to ask informative questions pertaining to the campus-wide master plan synthetic turf fields and PFAS. We have, as our, who else is up there? We have a number of guests here and on our electronic hookup. So why don't we start, and I will start off with a question for Dr. Peasley, if possible. You have done some work, I believe unpublished, on the PFAS in turf fields. I was wondering if you could say a few words about it.
Sure, I'm happy to be invited. Thank you. I hear myself, so that's a little bit disconcerting, but it'll work. We have been working on, ooh, that's really hard. Let me see if I can turn this down a little. Can you still hear me? Okay, so we've been working on PFAS in all sorts of materials, consumer products, in terms of cosmetics and papers and all sorts of other things, textiles. And we're trying to trace from the environmental perspective where the PFAS comes from and where it goes to. And there's lots of experts here that'll tell you how it affects human health and where it goes. But these are forever chemicals. So once we make them on a product, they last in the environment. And that's the concern. And nobody knew anything about synthetic turf grass fields until a few consumer groups, some of them represented here, started measuring them in water supplies adjacent to these new turf fields that are being put down everywhere. And so we have explored that. My graduate student is on here, Heather, who's doing this as part of her thesis project. And we are investigating the use of a polymer processing aid, which is the turf grass is not made out of PFAS, but the industry is not being forthcoming when they say they don't use PFAS at all, because in order to extrude the leaves that are used as the blades of grass, those are types of what's called low density polyethylene. It's a polymer like the grocery bags, the plastic grocery bags, except they're tinted green and they're made to look like leaves, and they didn't last long as grocery bags. So they've made them into more firm polymers by adding a little heavier ingredient of a polymer in there. But when they do that, it was not extruding correctly, and the leaves, the blades would not be smooth. And so rather than replace the entire $1 million machinery, they've been using something called a polymer processing aid, which helps extrude the leaves. And we got confirmation from the industry just last year. They've denied it for several years. No, we don't use it. But it's on the website that these things are used. And so we asked, and finally last year, the industry spokesman that they had came and told us, yes, they do use it. And we've been measuring it on the leaves. What it does is it coats the surface so that it can be extruded. And these PFAS are not intentionally put there, but they come out at the part per million level, or tens of parts per million level, that we can see of total fluorine sitting on these leaf blades. And they will come off. They're not adhered strongly, but they will stay there. Some of them are adhered strongly. Some of them are on the surface and will come off. And so we suspect that this is a source of PFAS in the environment. We think that the plastics industry and the turf grass industry in particular is a very large user of this particular type of fluoropolymer. And therefore, in the individual field, is it going to absolutely kill everything around it? Absolutely not. But it will, they're forever chemicals. Once they come off, they will stay into your water supply, and Nantucket has a precious one. So that's why people are alarmed. It's still, we're trying to investigate which PFAS they are. We don't have an answer to that yet, but we have some ideas. And we know that they're there and measurable. Heather's got wonderful data, but we will not be ready to publish for another 6 months or 5 months or something like that till we have all the data that we can suggest and examine what it is. There are lots of observations of ponds and such that have measured PFAS around these fields, and that's that's an answer to your question, if that's good enough.
Thank you. Pauline?
One of the questions that I have is around the soil testing and the outcomes. I know we've done some soil testing. If I could ask just to get a report on that, please.
Sure. My name's Steve LaRosa. I am a team leader and technical leader for Weston and Sampson Engineers, Inc. And I have, for the past number of years, been specializing in emerging contaminants, and in particular in PFAS related contaminants. We have taken a look at the soils that were sampled here at your facility. You had a fellow go out and collect a soil sample, one from the football field and one from what looks to be the area that will be the soccer field. And they were analyzed by a method that is not an EPA certified method, but is the best method we have available right now for analyzing soils. And they found a number of soluble PFAS in the soil at concentrations that are around what we would expect to see in the background of the environment. We haven't talked a lot about what PFAS are or why they're out here and so ubiquitous in the world, but studies that I'm familiar with have shown that the level of PFAS and types of PFAS that are seen in your soils right now are at concentrations that would be expected as a background concentration.
Can I just do a follow-up on that and just ask to whomever, is there a safe level of PFAS? And if that is the case, what would that level be?
So there's no, let me introduce myself first. I'm Marie Ruderman from Weston and Sampson. I'm a risk assessor and toxicologist.
Could I ask you to speak into the microphone? I can't hear you, sorry.
Sure.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Marie Ruderman. I'm a risk assessor and toxicologist from Weston and Sampson. The question was, is there a safe level of PFAS? So there are standards out there. There's a federal standard for drinking water of 70 parts per trillion. And then there's and that's for 2 different PFAS. PFAS are a group of compounds. There are thousands of them, and only 2 are regulated federally at the moment. And in Massachusetts, there's a drinking water standard of 20 parts per trillion. They took the EPA standard and they decreased it for safety reasons. And they actually included 6 PFAS instead of the 2. So in Massachusetts, we have one of the most conservative standard for PFAS in drinking water. There's no standard for turf. However, there are standards that are that have been drafted up by Mass Department of Environmental Protection for soil, for leaching from the soil into groundwater, into drinking water, and for direct contact. And the levels that were found in soil are less than the available standards.
This is Dr. DeWitt. Dr. Bennett has a comment, and then if she doesn't make a comment, then I would also like to make a comment.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify what Ms. Ruderman said. There are no federal regulations on any PFAS. None of them are regulated right now. It is a very large class, depending on how you define PFAS. On EPA's CompTox database, they say there are 12,039. However, under EPA's working definition, there are 6,504. They have only done toxicity risk assessments for a handful of these, and they are going to be starting to regulate next year, a couple of them. But something that's important, I think, is that we have very little toxicity information on the vast majority of these PFAS, which are concerning. Every one that I have seen risk assessments for show toxicity. But something that's important for you to keep in mind is that on November 16th of this past year, EPA came up with new risk assessments for PFOA and PFOS. And their reference dose, which is the estimate of daily exposure that is likely to be without an appreciable risk of effects during adverse effects during a lifetime, their new reference dose for PFOA is 0.006 parts per trillion. And for PFOS, it's 0.029 parts per trillion. Those are so low that it's approaching a level of no safe level. So I hope that answers your question a little. Unfortunately, because we have so little toxicity information on this vast array of chemicals, my clients at EPA tell me it would take 1,000 years to do risk assessments on all of them. We really have to start regulating these as a class and invoke the precautionary principle here, because some of them are very, very toxic.
And this is Dr. DeWitt. May I make an additional comment? So I just wanted to follow up on what Dr. Bennett had to say and to remind everybody that these are synthetic compounds. So there's really technically no background concentration of PFAS. They're in the environment because they've been produced by humans, and they will stay in the environment because they are produced by humans. So the term background is a little bit misleading because that implies that they're part of the Earth's environment when in fact they are not. And I would also like to reinforce what Dr. Bennett said. When we talk about safe levels of PFAS, we're really talking about levels that we accept in the environment and that we accept into human bodies. 0 is the only safe level of PFAS in the environment or in our bodies. Any other level that we suggest would just be acceptable. And the drinking water advisory is just that. It's a health advisory level. So as Dr. Bennett said, it's not a legally enforceable standard at this time, but the EPA may enact some legally enforceable standards for drinking water for only 2 PFAS compounds. Thank you.
I do have a question. Will this impact the aquifer? Sure.
Hi, this is Steve LaRosa again. I also am a hydrogeologist, and so that's a very loaded question. Is this going to affect the aquifer? From what we have seen in the laboratory analyses that have been done on these materials that are being proposed for the turf fields, there are low estimated concentrations of PFAS that appear to be present in some of these materials, and in a leaching test where they actually put what is supposed to be chemically rainwater on these materials to see what leaches, there are some low levels of PFAS that are released by some of these materials. The concentrations that they're observing and that we've seen in these tests and reports are comparable to or less than what has been observed in rainwater, in what we have in our bodies and excrete every day. So there are some PFAS that are identified that are released, but they're at very, very low levels. Those levels are actually, as I said, below what we see in rainwater. And so although if these compounds were to run off of the field in the rainwater, I'm not sure that you would be able to see a difference in the concentration in that runoff water as compared to the rainwater that's falling on the fields. And then the other kind of portion of this that's we've got to wrap our heads around is how many other sources of PFAS are there out there that might potentially impact or be impacting your aquifer. And again, as I said, the rainwater that falls, all of the wastewater that goes into your soil-based leach fields for all of the homes that are within the area. They all have elevated levels of these PFAS in the 5 to 10 to 20 part per trillion range. So I guess that's a long way of me saying that there certainly has been in the data very low estimated concentrations of PFAS that could run off of these materials, but that's so low that I don't see that it would have a measurable impact or even an impact to the shallow groundwater here on the island.
You are aware of the problems we're having in the proximity to the airport.
Absolutely.
You can say it's the soluble PFAS used in foam sprays, but do we have a PFAS deficiency? Do we need more? That's my question about the turf fields. Dr. Bennett. No, Dr. Bennett.
I'd be happy to address that, but I think Kristen Mello also should. We have seen some data that shows that once artificial turf fields are put in, the surrounding wetlands and waters and groundwater does indeed increase in PFAS levels. We've seen that in several places in Connecticut, in my town, which did not have a PFAS problem until we installed 2 turf fields, and we just paid $9.5 million for a filtration system because our drinking water is contaminated. But to say that it's not going to, that the PFAS in the artificial turf is not going to contaminate the groundwater or the aquifer is, I think, not true. It is, as Dr. Peasley said, once you put this in there, it's staying in there. And because we are heading towards a place in the regulatory landscape where for at least some of these, there are no safe levels, to say, oh, it's just a little bit, it's okay to put this in, this additional PFAS in, is nonsensical to me. But I do think that Kristen Mello has some great information on this question.
Thank you, Dr. Bennett. If it please the chair, I would just like to point out that, first of all, to answer your question, nobody needs more PFAS. Nobody. Especially communities that have already been impacted by PFAS and already have PFAS in measurable amounts in their bodies, because we are already fighting an uphill battle and nobody needs more, not anybody. Number one. Number two, I would like to echo something that Mr. LaRosa, I believe, said, in that this is a shallow, precious aquifer. This is not, you do not have, a plan B here. So this is a sole source, precious water resource. And yes, there are many other contributing factors of PFAS. And so choosing whether or not you want to intentionally add more is what's before you. Now, the interesting thing about the PFAS testing and the soil testing is that, first of all, when we talk about them being low estimated values in the turf and the infill and the shock pad, I would like to point out, particularly, I think you have a Weston and Sampson letter with a table. I would like to point out the denominators used in that table. Now, those denominators happen to be the, quote, reporting limit, which means that anything underneath that number isn't in your table. It says it's non-detect. But if you will look, those denominators with the turf and the infill and the shock pad are much higher than they are for your soil test. Okay, so what that means is that, say you're taking a picture of what's on the landscape, the picture that you're taking with the turf and the infill and the shock pad have a barn in front of your camera. You can't see what's there because your reporting level is astronomically high compared to what you're saying is the background level of the soil. And let me just echo Dr. DeWitt, there is no background. These are man-made and intentionally added into our lives, and they're poisonous. So that all being said, I have gone through and looked at data from several different communities in order to figure out what's coming off these fields, how much of it was already there, how much is from the field, where it's going, and what it looks like. And I will tell you, not one has had nothing. So there are different compounds. I have even gone so far as to find the literature that explains how these polymer processing aids might be breaking down under UV radiation. It's a play on words to say that this compound is inert. It is a play on words to say it is insoluble in water. Once you have created the free radicals, then broken up this polymer, it is available in water and it is available to be drinking. And so I would just caution you to look at the fine print on everything you get, because comparing apples to apples, the numbers they're giving you for the soil, 0.696, right? The background you're not looking behind on the shock pad is 9.5. How many 0.696s can you get in there? At least 9, right? You need to compare apples to apples and read the fine print. And the reason they bring me into these conversations is because I'm not anal to look at the fine print. That's me. Thanks.
And Kristen, you're exactly correct. And actually, when I was reviewing our letter today, I realized that we had put the reporting limits into that table. And so I went back into the raw data to take a look at what the minimum detection limits are. And I know all you other chemists in the audience are enjoying this, but when you look at those minimum detection limits, those numbers are in that 0.12 to 0.14 concentration level. So in looking back through that raw lab data, I was able to confirm that all of the turf materials that were tested gave non-detect levels at a detection limit well below the actual soil concentrations, about 1/6 of them. And I apologize for not catching that error in that table when that got put together. But the data that we do have from that Martha's Vineyard test, if we dig deep into it, it does have those concentrations well below and more akin to what you saw for those soil concentrations. Again, I apologize for not catching that previously.
Ms. Marlman?
do have a question. In,
Get into the mic.
in Portsmouth, there was a turf field installed. They were told it was PFAS free by Weston and Sampson. And they're currently looking at testing their field. What happens if we implement a turf system and find out that it does in fact have PFAS that leaches into our water or soil? Who's going to pay for the removal? Is there a budget in place to do the consistent testing if this field is put down?
I can address part of the beginning of that question with regard to the financials and all. I don't think that that's something that I can speak to. But we did have that field prior to that field being installed. It was tested for all of the PFAs that can be quantified or that can actually be identified by the current lab methodologies that are out there today. And all of those materials came back as non-detect for the identifiable PFAS that we can actually quantify or say PFOA is or is not this concentration. As folks have said, unfortunately, there's thousands of these kinds of compounds, and the lab techniques can't identify every single one of them at this point. But the ones that the EPA and that toxicologists have found and believe to be the most worrisome from toxicity standpoint and exposure standpoint, these are the compounds that have been used the most historically. We did not see any of those in those materials in Portsmouth.
Wasn't the field in Portsmouth, this Portsmouth, New Hampshire, sold as PFAS-free?
It was indicated in the specifications that it would be PFAS-free in accordance with the European Union definition, the REACH definition, and the California State Prop 65 definition, which actually are only for PFOS and Pfoa. The specifications for that field actually required testing well beyond those two compounds to, I believe it was 29 compounds, and that testing not be performed on a random sample of the materials, but actually the exact lot numbers of each of those materials that would be placed in that field.
Dr. Carrigan? You heard that? Was wondering what you thought.
Dr. Peasley and Dr. Bolt.
Switching around. Dr. Peasley, we'll hit you.
Sure, I don't want to interrupt from Courtney, who can tell you a lot about the exposure methods, but one of the things that I can talk about is this number 29. That's the number of the EPA method 537, modified usually, to measure the number of PFAS that we can detect with a typical instrumentation. There is 99.9% of the PFAS is not measured. This is less than 1/10 of 1% that we're regulating on. Most of the load out there is what's called precursor mass. These are things that degrade from polymers or degrade from other types of more complicated PFAS. And while PFAS themselves, the short chain, the medium chains never go away, these precursors do break down. And so you may not have a single measurable PFAS on there, but if you put a polymeric field down and let it expose to the UV light, sunlight, and water, you will start generating not just small quantities, but large quantities of these small PFAS, quite a bit higher than what we're talking about. We detect total fluorine on these fields in the part per million range, not part per billion, not part per trillion. And the health advisory limits are part per trillion. But of course, you don't eat your fields, so that's okay. But the number of those that break down over time are certainly not negligible. And if we do such things as oxidize the sample, you will get part per billion levels of some of these PFAS off. So that all that could come out over time. You're not going to boil your fields or anything like that, but there's to say that it's not measuring in Pfoa or Pfos, those aren't parts of the polymers that we're using anyway. Those just happen to be side impurities in the manufacture. the bulk of the material we're not measuring. And that leads us to believe that there are these continual source of PFAS that could come off this. And I'll let Courtney talk to the exposure science.
I just wanted to ask you to define what a precursor is, because people might not be familiar with that term, Graham.
Oh, sorry about that. Yes, I speak science too much. It means that there are these larger molecules that are PFAS containing. They are PFAS in themselves, but they often have other bits that connect. And the most common ones are textiles, for example. Textiles are made out of nylon or some sort of polyester, and you can attach fluorinated compounds to them. And of course, the fluorinated compounds never go away. They're very strong, but the attachment points do. And so these chemicals shed off. That's an example of a polymer that could shed into this. And that's what I meant by precursor.
So we often talk about precursors as PFASs that will transform into the more persistent PFASs that actually are somewhat regulated. So that's often how I hear the term used as well.
Okay.
I'd like to add to actually what Dr. Peasley had to say with regard to the kind of the other fluorine compounds and fluorines that are found, and some of that oxidation of precursors that he was talking about. The materials that they tested at Martha's Vineyard, one of the tests they did do was actually one of these oxidation tests, where they essentially put the material in something like a Drano type solution, a very, very strong oxidizer, and heat it up to a very high temperature, and then analyze what they've been able to extract using that very aggressive methodology to try and get a sense of what this kind of hidden PFAS or degradation could be. And those results also showed very low concentrations of what we can measure for individual compounds at levels that are well below the drinking water standard and the soil standards. So I just wanted to let you know that actually had been done in those types of materials.
But is that 10 years in the sun and rain?
It actually can take these materials, they take the sample and they will cryomill them. So they actually will freeze these in a liquid nitrogen, grind them up to a powder, and then immerse them in this solution and make essentially a slurry out of these materials, and then analyze what that slurry is when they're all done. So they run it up to several hundred degrees Fahrenheit to try and get all of this oxidation done. My belief is that is a very aggressive method and should give us an idea of what is available to oxidize out of those materials.
So if student athletes do play on these proposed synthetic fields, how are they impacted by the exposure to PFAS?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Yeah, so if and when players play on these proposed synthetic fields, what is the impact of the exposure to PFAS upon the player?
Well, yes. The concentrations of PFAS that were detected in the fields in the synthetic turf were essentially at background, and they were actually less than the concentrations that we detected in soil. And so they were well below the direct contact standards for exposure to PFAS. And so I believe that there's no significant risk associated with direct contact exposure to PFAS.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part of what you said.
I believe that there's no significant risk associated with direct contact exposure to PFAS on the fields.
To the player?
To the player.
So is there any research to support that belief?
There's the data from the Martha's Vineyard study, and there's data that we've collected from numerous turf fields that show that there's non-detectable levels of PFAS.
So I'm not asking about the field itself, I'm asking about the impact upon the player. So it's a different question. Is there any research or any, has there been any long-term studies about the player?
There have been no long-term studies on PFAS exposure from the turf because PFAS is an emerging contaminant and there's not a lot of information available just yet.
So just to clarify, there is no research about the effects upon the player?
There's no research because there's not significant concentrations of PFAS coming off the field.
I see. Thank you.
Dr. Bennett, you had your hand raised?
Thank you. A couple of things. First of all, I'd like to go back to the question that was asked about what happens if we put it down and then find that there's PFAS in our water from the field. Just a warning that this happened in Connecticut, where there was a municipality that had a contract that said no PFAS, and they measured before and they measured after, and the PFAS doubled after the turf field was put in. And the manufacturer said, well, how can you prove it's from us? How can you prove it's from our turf field? And that's a very difficult thing to do, to prove that the specific PFAS that you're finding in the water are coming from that field. It seems obvious. It's certainly circumstantial evidence. I'm putting my lawyer hat on here, but it's impossible to say, yes, it's definitely the PFAS from this field. So my point to you there is that once you've opened that barn door and the horse is out, it's very hard to get it back in. And I think you're going to have an impossible time trying to get a manufacturer to be responsible for that. What Ms. Rudiman just said, though, was difficult for me to listen to. The reason that there are no studies done on PFAS exposure to players is because I was the one who found PFAS in artificial turf in 2019. It's been 3 years. We were and the industry denied it for quite a long time. So is there an impact? There have been no studies because nobody's done a study. There should be a study. And the 3 pathways of exposure, and Dr. DeWitt, I'm sure, can say much more about this, but it's ingestion, inhalation, and dermal absorption. And Dr. Peasley as well has done a number of studies on firefighter turnout gear, which has PFAS in it and is adversely impacting them. And the last thing I want to say before I hope Dr. DeWitt can say something about the dermal exposure, but it's not because it's safe that the studies haven't been done. The studies haven't been done because the studies haven't been done. We just discovered this. But in the Martha's Vineyard turf field, the consultant found PFOA in the turf. And remember, this is the one that EPA just came out and said there may be no safe level of PFOA. So I don't care how low it is, it's frightening and of concern. They found PFHPA in the turf, the shock pad, and the Brock fill. And they found PFHXA in the turf, the shock pad, and the Brock fill. So yeah, I think it's all of concern. Thank you.
Do you have something to add? Well, I just wanted, she referenced Dr. DeWitt, and that's why I wanted to give. Did you have anything to add, Dr. DeWitt, to that?
Oh, yes, sir. Thank you. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about what we do know about the health effects of PFAS, and the vast majority of information that we have about their health effects does come from only a few individual compounds. Most of our studies have been done with PFOA and PFOS, which are only 2 PFAS. And many of our studies really do focus on drinking water exposures, but that's because we know the most about PFAS in drinking water. There have been some studies of absorption of PFAS through skin, and there have been very few studies looking at what happens to health when PFAS are inhaled or breathed in. But the studies that we do have really highlight that PFAS are known as multi-system toxicants. In other words, once they get into your body, they can have effects across many different organ systems, I study in my laboratory their effects on the immune system. One of the effects is that they reduce our body's response to vaccinations, which is pretty concerning right now, considering that we're trying to get folks vaccinated so that we can fight the pandemic. We also know that PFAS can affect the liver. They can increase cholesterol and triglyceride levels that we measure in our blood. They can have effects on babies when they develop. They can have effects on reproduction. They can have effects on the placenta, and they can induce certain types of cancer, most notably kidney cancer and testicular cancer. But there have been studies linking them to prostate cancer, breast cancer, and bladder cancer. And I should highlight some of the emerging studies on cancers are linking breast cancer to soccer fields that have artificial turf. So these are some emerging data. I would also really like to highlight that for many PFAS, they're not really emerging compounds anymore. We know quite a bit about their toxicity. We know quite a bit about what they do to bodies when they get taken into bodies. Some PFAS that have not been well studied still are emerging with respect to their toxicity. But for the vast majority of PFAS that have been studied, there is solid evidence that they are toxic through multiple routes of exposure. And I think Dr. Kerrigan also has some comments to add.
Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, I just want to echo what Dr. DeWitt said. All of that is true. ATSDR, the Agency of Toxic Substances and Disease Control Registry, has written an 800-page literature review of PFAS and the health effects and has some really nice figures in there showing a compilation of that literature. So I encourage you to take a look at that if you are interested in understanding more about the health effects of PFAS, what we know from the PFAS that we have studied. Back to the question about exposure to players on the field, just wanted to highlight some of the gaps in what we know about PFAS exposure from dermal absorption. So there have been only a few studies that have looked at PFAS dermal absorption. There's some indication of up to 50% absorption through the skin, but the studies really aren't very good. So, if you want to be precautionary about what you think will be absorbed dermally, that 50% absorption factor might be useful to use, although we know use of absorption factors does tend to underestimate what dermal exposure would be. And so there are groups working on better developing better data to better estimate dermal absorption. But, I think it's very premature to say and conclude that there is no risk to players. I think we just don't have the data to be able to back that up.
A little bit about that. So there's no question that PFAS are toxic. We all know in the risk assessment and toxicology field that PFAS are toxic. However, you have to have exposure to the PFAS to have a toxic effect. And the thing is, we're not seeing concentrations that would cause a toxic effect in the fields. These fields have minute concentrations that, under laboratory conditions that are extremely stringent, very low concentrations of PFAS come out of the fields under laboratory conditions. They are so low that all of the values are estimated values by the lab. They're not even above detection limits. So you have to have a concentration before you can have exposure and effect. So from what we're seeing in the synthetic turf, those concentrations just aren't there. There is a dermal contact standard for PFAS that's been, it's in draft form from DEP, and it's 300 parts per billion. We've seen nothing even approaching that kind of concentration from the fields. So you have to understand that to have a toxic effect, you not only have to have the presence of a compound, you have to have, it has to be bioavailable, it has to be able to be absorbed by the body. And so far, the synthetic turf that we've tested does not have concentrations that come out, under natural conditions. that are, that are even detectable. So, yes, PFAS are extremely toxic. And we do, actually, that's a huge thing that Steve and I work on. We evaluate hazardous waste sites and we work on PFAS cleanup. Are these concentrations that will cause a toxic effect? Based on the data that's available right now, with my experience as a toxicologist for 27 years, the concentrations just aren't there to cause a toxic effect.
Does anybody want to speak to that?
I was just hoping to circle back a little bit to some of the discussion of two things. One is knowing if and when the fields may have impacted the environment surrounding them. We have been putting together and will have later this week for the town a monitoring program which will involve installation of monitoring wells and collection of soils, not only shallow, but at the depths which are anticipated to be removed to put in these new fields. And we're looking at evaluating all of the areas that the proposed fields will be coming to. So not only in the turf field areas, but also over where the soccer fields are. And talking with Mark here about what his concerns are and what our thoughts are regarding potential impacts to the shallow aquifer, we're planning on looking at not only PFAS, but other compounds like the nitrogen series, pesticides, herbicides, any of the potential contaminants for that aquifer that might be associated with any of the field uses that are out here. So I agree that if there is an impact that occurs, that certainly is not what we're anticipating, but at least we'll have some data from before the fields are put in, right adjacent to where the fields are, so we can compare that to the post-field installation and really be able to pinpoint, are these changes associated with the field? And then just very quickly to the quantification of PFAS in the Martha's Vineyard materials, where they did find PFAS that are quantifiable. I'd just like to note that you're very correct in that they saw it in each one of the materials, the infill, the pad, and the grass. Consistently, the highest concentrations that were reported were in the natural pine tree-based infill, not in the synthetic plastic grasses or in the pad or even in the glues. The highest concentrations were actually coming from the natural materials that are planned to be used as infill. And again, that concentration, when I look at it, seems very similar to what they see in a Vermont study that they did in the Green Mountains, where there's been no active development. The concentrations they see in that natural material is very similar to what we see in the study of, and I understand the nomenclature of, well, background should only be natural, but it's unfortunately, it's what we're seeing everywhere. We see it in the ice in the Antarctic. We see these compounds everywhere. So it is kind of this malaise that unfortunately has covered the earth. The concentrations that we saw in those turf materials for Martha's Vineyard, they're in that typical range, not an elevated range, but in that typical range.
I would ask the question, do we need more PFAS then? Because it seems we have a background or whatever level, and we're going to add to it. Am I correct?
I'm not sure that you are adding to it, because even if you bring in new organic soils, for instance, they will have that same level, or as we see out on the fields today, a concentration actually higher than what these synthetic fields are. So there isn't a material that you can bring in that's going to be cleaner than what you have out there right now as a natural material. In point of fact, the turf and the pad actually is testing at a lower concentration than what you're playing on right now.
But it seems to me if you add 1 and 1, you still get 2.
Right, and if you bring in that organic soil from somewhere else, you're adding 1 and 1 again. It is in all of these materials, unfortunately.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So if we're monitoring the levels and we find high concentration, no matter what the ground surface is, what do we do if we've got a high concentration?
Well, I don't believe that what you will see is an elevated or high concentration, but if that were to occur, and it is specifically from the turf materials, we would be able to identify that very, very quickly. And I guess the turf materials could be removed, and the stormwater, the runoff from these fields, is actually being collected and directed to a finite area. That area could be excavated and removed. And that's frankly how we deal with high concentration sources, like you mentioned the airport earlier. If we know where there's been a fire or concentrated training where they put a lot of these materials down, that removal is the very first thing that you would do to get that numbers of pounds of source material out of there. Mm-hmm. But again, I don't believe that you'll see elevated concentrations. But what we want to do here is really be able to identify that, really have the monitoring in place to assure the community that this isn't something that's being 1 and 1 and making 2 or adding something to the system.
See, as an example though, everybody thought the Challenger was all set to go. And then there was a whoopsie. If we have a whoopsie here and we contaminate our water, we've contaminated this, what do we do with the old turf? You can only make so many putting greens.
Right, and actually there's been a development in the last couple months where there is now being built a recycling facility in Pennsylvania that will be up and running in the next, was it 3 or
Quarter one.
quarter one of next year. So there is finally going to be a local recycling option for these, so that we can bring those to be reused. But with regard to the whoopsie and with regard to a point source, I think one of the things that I keep coming back to when I look at these kinds of proposed projects is you do have a couple of acres of materials you're putting down on the ground here. I mean, that's a pretty big area. And if all of that turf degraded and released the PFAS that we know is used in it, this polymer, what number of pounds would that be? What type of source would that be? And when you start thinking about how much rain falls on the island that has PFAS in it, all of the wastewater disposal systems, stormwater runoff, and those things, this doesn't become a point source or a mass like you have at the airport, where they put literally dozens to hundreds of pounds of PFAS in a concentrated area. This is, as I said before, I don't see concentrations coming off that are any different than any soil you would bring in here, but I don't see it as a concentrated point source type of event that you would be putting in. And again, that's how I view it as I look at the whole system.
But you don't live here.
I don't live here, but I've spent 35 years of my life dedicated to minimizing and remediating and fixing potential health impacts and impacts to the environment. And I have no interest in saying something that's going to result in an unacceptable impact to anybody's environment.
Dr. Bennett, do you have any comments on that?
I do, but I believe that both Kristen and Heather had their hands up before me, so I would love to have them speak first, and then I would like to go as well.
Heather was first.
Hi, Heather Whitehead. I'm Graham's graduate student here at Notre Dame, and I'm a third year. My focus is on analytical chemistry, and something I wanted to address was this idea that the 300 ppb of dermal exposure would be the set point to reach. The concentrations that were measured in the data that you have thus far may not be at 300 ppb, but the concentrations that Graham and I can measure through our total fluorine analysis is in the parts per million range, and that's 1,000-fold higher than any parts per billion level concentration. And that ties back into the issue of we have targeted analysis techniques that we're referring to here, and the data that we're referring to is targeted analysis techniques, where we're looking at 29 compounds. We have been told by Dr. Bennett there's up to 12,000 different PFAS that can be classified as PFAS. So we know we're missing a significant portion of the concentrations that we can potentially measure. So the 300 ppb may not be met by what you can measure through these targeted analysis techniques, but in 20 years, if the field is there and we have better analysis methods that allow us to analyze hundreds of compounds, that criteria is fairly likely to be met based on Graham's and I's measurements in the parts per million range. And then additionally, I want to say that this exposure or potential exposure through a turf field doesn't happen in a vacuum. So we're making the assumption that the only point exposure would be through the turf field. But as we've already discussed, there's exposure through our drinking water, through our food sources, through the rain, through the soil, things like that. Any additional exposure is a concern. And when we know that there's already impacted communities, additional exposure is a huge thing we try to limit. And especially through things that are not necessary, such as artificial turf, consumer products, things of that nature.
So this is Kristen, and I would just like to say I would second everything Heather just said. And also I would say that when we are comparing the soil values, right, the 0.7 nanograms per gram, when you did the top assay in Martha's Vineyard, you came out with answers where PFBA was up at like 28 parts per billion. The post-oxidation for PFHPA was above 20 parts per billion, not parts per trillion, parts per billion. And there at least 7 in the turf. So in addition to the turf, you've got it coming off the shock pad, you've got it coming off the Brockville, and that's just from oxidizing it chemically, right? So yes, it's harsh. Yes, it's like Drano. Okay. But the thing is, you're trying to model what would happen after years and years and years of otherwise beating it down and how much would come off. And 30 parts per billion is nothing to sneeze at. That's a lot. And when you're considering the area of this carpet and how much of it is going down, and the fact that you've already got one and an airport and a bunch of septic, you need to keep in mind that this stuff is cumulative. It's not going anywhere. And every bit you bring onto the island is yours to keep. So you're going to pay to have all of this turf shipped over there, and somebody's going to pay to drill all those monitoring wells and test all those monitoring. You're going to fly that stuff off the island on ice, FedEx overnight, that somebody's willing to do all that testing. And then who's going to pay for it when you have to rip it up? Who's going to pay for it when somebody sues you guys because you used to be under the limit, but now with all this extra stuff, you're over the limit, and now you don't have drinking water, and now you need GAC filters. But of course, GAC filters don't remove everything, and you don't even know what PFAS are in there because nobody bothered to do the testing. That you're sitting here with a decision about whether or not you want someone to lay down grass seed and sand and move dirt that's already on your island from one place to another versus shipping in tons of toxic material that is somebody else's waste. I think you need to look at this more carefully.
Thank you. And my few comments are this. First of all, I think we should put to rest the whole background level thing, because as everybody has said, this is not a natural background level. So when you were talking about, oh, it's in the natural rock fill, well, guess what? Tetra Tech found PFOA in the turf and the shock pad. Remember, again, I'm beating a dead horse, I know, but PFOA is the one that may have no safe level. So you can't say, oh, it's only a little amount, because there may be no safe level, zero safe level of PFOA. And that is in the turf and it is in the shock pad. It is regulated by the state of Massachusetts. It will be regulated by EPA next year. That's number one. Number two, we have to stop comparing this to Vermont soils. Forget about that one study that was done on Vermont soils, and here's why. Vermont generates the fourth most PFAS in the entire country, okay? Number one. Number two, think about all that ski wax, that's PFAS, that is getting into that soil and that groundwater. That's why Vermont soils are so contaminated. Do not compare Martha's Vineyard to Vermont, because it is not a valid comparison. Number three, there are 650 PFAS that are currently, from what EPA can tell, currently being used in the US. But of those 650 PFAS, 96% are confidential business information. We do not know the chemical formula. We do not know the toxicity information. We don't know where it's manufactured. We don't know what it's used for. We know nothing, because it's confidential business information. So when Heather was talking about total organic fluorine and all of these PFAS that we have no idea what they are, that's because the industry won't tell us and EPA is not making them tell us. It's all confidential business information. Some of these PFAS may be more toxic than PFOA and PFOS and Gen X. We have no idea. And the fact that you're considering putting in acres of this plastic turf that contains, we don't even know which PFAS, on a sole source aquifer is mind-boggling to me. It was Ms. Rudiman who came to my town and told us that our turf field was going to be totally safe. I wish she lived here so her taxes could go up and she could pay for the $9.5 million filtration system that we now have to put in. And the last thing that I want to say is microplastics. These things break off. They break off, and the PFAS that is on those little pieces of microplastics that break off, the blades break off. It's, let me see, fiber loss, average reduction of 0.32 millimeters per year. It increases with the age. From year 0 to 5, it's 0.2 millimeters per year, year 5 to 10, 0.5 millimeter per year. And it's just because of the aging and the brittleness of the fibers with the UV light and all of that. So we're talking about 55 to 218 kilograms of microplastics per year, per field, coming off and getting into your water supply. And each tiny little bit of microplastic is a little toxic bomb that's filled with PFAS and other chemicals. So that is something else that you should be considering. Thank you.
And Council.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And thanks for the opportunity to be here. I'm Emily Molden. I'm the Executive Director of the Nantucket Land Council, and we have a history of reviewing projects and proposals on island that have the potential to impact our environment and resources. We also, as the paper pointed out a few weeks ago, have a long history of advocacy for the protection of our waters specifically. We were significant in petitioning the federal government to designate our aquifer as a sole source aquifer back in the 1980s. We also worked in 1990 with the Horsley-Witten Group to delineate our island's watersheds, which are still used consistently for regulatory and research purposes. And I do just want to point out that in addition to this site being located within the contribution zone to our public wellhead, it is also within the Nantucket Harbor watershed. We actually had hired the Horsley Witten Group, who reviewed a lot of the proposal over on the Vineyard for the Martha's Vineyard Commission, to help us review a lot of the information that we received from the schools locally for Nantucket's proposed turf fields. And while we had them look at a number of components, including stormwater as well, I'll just focus right now on some of the comments and concerns that we have around the PFAS as we've been talking about tonight. So yes, the materials that are going to be used for the actual fields on Nantucket, the analysis of PFAS compounds have shown to have levels in them that are below most of the comparison or the standard values that are used by regulatory agencies to assess risk. But again, as has been discussed, the difficulty in talking about the significance of those levels or the measurable impact is that we're really only looking at standards for 6 of these compounds. The science is still just too young for a real full, complete assessment of PFAS risk, and we believe that it's really significant, the analysis that was done with these oxidizable precursors that you've heard about, as well as the total fluorine, because that really identifies the potential for leachable compounds after UV degradation and environmental breakdown of the materials, as well as the potential for other compounds that we just don't have the technology available to detect as of yet. So overall, these results, they just represent a risk that at this time is unquantifiable. And the Land Council, based on what we know about the PFAS compounds that we do have science for, feels that it's not an appropriate risk to be taking in our wellhead contribution zone. Thank you very much.
Great. Yes, Rocky?
Yep. Are there any, good Lord, are there any peer reviewed toxicity studies on Pvdf? And that was for Dr. Jamie DeWitt.
So I can't think of any specific toxicity studies on polymers themselves. However, we know that polymers can break down. We know that polymers can release certain types of PFAS. We also know that during the production and the use phase of polymers, PFAS can be released into the environment. So the same types of toxicities that are associated with individual PFAS compounds can also be associated with PFAS polymers or polymers that are made with PFAS. There's also, I know there's been some language tossed around about polymers being inert and too big to get absorbed, but there's emerging data to indicate that this really isn't true for polymers, that they can be ingested, they can damage cells, they can kill cells, and they can get into living organisms. Dr. Bennett brought up the concept of microplastics, and polymers would fall into that category. So have there been specific studies on the types of polymers and the toxicity that they produce that are found in turf grass? I would say not to my knowledge, but I would also urge you to consider the toxicity of PFAS as a surrogate for the toxicity of fluorinated polymers.
I have one more question, Dr. Libri.
Sure.
Does anybody have any numbers on the injury rate for synthetic turf as opposed to natural grass?
Mr. Chairman?
Sure.
Dick Webb, landscape architect with SMRT. There are many studies regarding synthetic turf, comparative studies, injury-wise, comparing synthetic turf to natural grass turf. And quite frankly, the injury reports are inconsistent. There are some reports that say synthetic turf is safer, others say natural grass is safer. But the one point that I'd like to make is that every one of these studies are focusing on, let me pause for a second. There were 5 levels of natural grass fields. Sports turf managers rate the level, the quality of the field. Level 1 is the highest level field. Level 5 is the lowest quality. The studies that we see for injuries comparative between natural grass and turf focus on a comparison between a level 1 natural grass field and a synthetic turf field. So in essence, they are looking at injury reports for the NFL type stadiums, Major League Soccer, Division I football, that type of natural grass field. One of the big concerns that we have, what I have not seen yet, is a study that addresses the safety, comparative safety in injuries of a synthetic turf field to a level 3 or a level 4 natural grass field, which is what we have out here in Nantucket right now. We do not have a level 1 field. And so that is the study that I've never seen a study that, again, addresses the comparison between synthetic turf and a level 3 or 4 natural grass field. Have seen it at the higher levels.
Well, having been the team physician for the last 30 years, I really have not seen a large number of injuries. As a matter of fact, I can probably count the number of ACLs that I've seen. So I'm not sure I agree with you. I think our field, I have seen injuries, but I haven't seen a blight of injuries occurring on that field.
And sir, I'm not saying there are. The question was about the studies, and the studies, the conclusions in the studies that we've reviewed are frankly a mixed bag. But again, the studies are focusing on studying a high-performing natural grass field versus what we have out here.
I'd like to ask a follow-up question. Where are these studies published? Are they in medical journals? Where would we be able to access these?
A variety of places.
Can you name one or two?
I can certainly research some. There are medical journals. Many are admittedly authored by the synthetic turf industry. And so not as a surprise, their position is the synthetic turf is safer.
So it's a biased review.
There's a variety of reports. And I think it's also important to understand, as the chair pointed out, there are many different types of injuries and there are many different types of synthetic turf. And so that's complicating and potentially confusing the data. In other words, what we I think is generally accepted is some of the severity of the injuries are less in synthetic turf, particularly when it comes to head trauma and concussions. When you have a synthetic turf and you have the shock pad underneath you, that is a safer surface than a frozen natural grass field.
But again, these are from the research that you're interested in.
These are from a variety of researchers, yes.
So I would be interested in something that is not biased toward artificial turf. I would be interested in seeing some of that research.
We can share that. We can research the latest. It moves again, the studies, there's an inconsistency because some of it's authored by natural grass proponents and some are authored by synthetic turf. But we'll get you a package.
Thank you.
I think the quote on that is, there are lies, damn lies, and statistics. So, Pauline?
Yep, going back to the soil, the PFAS versus natural grass, and natural grass that has fertilizers. What is the more harming or concern of both of those fields?
So I would say that both are safe to play on. There were higher concentrations in the PFAS in the soil than we found in the synthetic turf, done by the apples to apples comparison of methods. And, but neither of them would cause a health risk.
Neither cause a health risk.
Do we have any answers or thoughts on that question? I don't think we got a fertilizer expert up there.
Well, so this is Dr. DeWitt. I think there are different types of health effects that can emerge with fertilizers. You're going to be concerned about ecological effects and eutrophication of waterways. Fertilizers themselves might lead to skin irritation and acute respiratory distress. PFAS are going to be around, though, a lot longer than fertilizers. Fertilizers are going to wash out of the soil, and Dr. Peasley can likely address this more quickly than PFAS. Fertilizers naturally get broken down by microbes, by sunlight, by air, by water. PFAS don't. So PFAS are going to produce long-lasting effects in populations from chronic exposure. They can produce effects on reproduction and development. So what you put into the environment now is going to be with your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, and probably even their children and great-grandchildren. So what is best for your community now versus what is best for your community use in the future are questions that you should be asking as you consider this decision today.
So I'm curious if PFAS has always been present in the turf. I know in Europe they've been using turf fields for years on their football fields. So I'm curious, are we just waking up to the knowledge of PFAS, or is it the change in material that we're using that has the increased presence of PFAS? Could you address that for me?
My understanding of the plastics extrusion process and what's been utilized historically is that the fluorinated additives have been present at least for the last 10 to 15 years, and maybe even farther back. The research that I've performed, I'm looking really, they're talking about 15 years is where I'm seeing it. So no, it's not brand new, but I'm not sure that they were using these polymers as extrusion aids, say back in the 60s or 70s.
That's correct. These polymer aids are relatively recent in terms of 15 to 20 years, but they've been used for that length of time. The reason that we honed in on them was that the plastics industry itself is the biggest user of fluorochemistry. And so it's a huge market for the industry that sells these chemicals. And the plastics industry just found it as a processing aid to make it better material and to make it to perform to its standards better. But the side note is that 15 years ago, nobody mentioned the word PFAS. It wasn't even called that till 8 years ago. And so this is why it's still emerging, even though several of the toxicities are well known. The ubiquity of this came out in a paper last year. There's 200 different industrial uses of this chemical in every walk of life, and the plastics industry is the largest user, and that's why this is of interest. And it's just the quantity that you have. Turf grass fields are large, and there's a lot of them being put in.
Alternative substance that we can use, a material that we can use? Sorry.
There may be. I think that is a really interesting question for the manufacturing community and for what can work as effectively and economically for them. These are pretty inexpensive compounds to make. They do their job very well, and it just like, frankly, asbestos and PCBs, it will take the society in general applying the pressure that these are going to be unacceptable and you need to find an alternative. I don't know enough about the plastics industry to know if there's something viable already that they just don't want to use.
Okay. Thank you.
If I can add to that, Shaw Industries, which makes a lot of the artificial turf, said that they have not been able to come up with an alternative to PFAS. And TURI, the Toxics Use Reduction Institute at University of Massachusetts Lowell, has a lot of research on the difference between artificial turf and natural grass, and they actually helped the city of Springfield, Massachusetts, put in an organic natural grass field that's been going great for their fields there. They are a city of over 150,000, so much bigger than Nantucket. They don't have any problems with it, and they are really pushing for natural grass as an alternative because there doesn't seem to be a safe alternative for the artificial turf. And it's not, again, not just the PFAS, it's the microplastics. There's so much involved with it. And if I could just for a second go back to add to what Dr. DeWitt said about the Pvdf. There is one paper, and I'd be happy to send it to you afterwards, on fluoropolymers. And the researchers concluded in this recent paper, there are serious concerns regarding the toxicity and adverse effects of fluorinated processing aids on humans and the environment. A variety of other PFAS, including monomers and oligomers, are emitted during the production, processing, use, and end-of-life treatment of fluoropolymers. And they do talk about Pvdf in that article, so I'd be happy to send it to you if you want to see it. And one other note on that recycling facility in Pennsylvania, we have been hearing about that recycling facility in Pennsylvania for about 10 years now. So today I took it upon myself to look into that parcel that they claim it's being built on, and it's still not owned by Rematch. They're looking at how much they have to remediate the land. So even if that does become a recycling facility, it's not going to happen, I don't think, anytime soon. Thank you.
Question about heavy metals. It seemed that at the Vineyard, there was a quote of something like 1 pound of antimony a year leaching out. And I wondered, antimony and lead, is there any concern about that?
If you're referring to the Martha's Vineyard study, they said that there was no significant risk associated with, bleaching from with metals and PFAS, leaching from the turf. Not sure exactly what you're referring to.
I don't know that we need 1 pound of antimony introduced into our water supply yearly. I think that was the quote. I perhaps am mistaken. I don't think so, but heavy metals in the turf.
I know that there's been concern in the past with heavy metals in the crumb rubber style infill, but that's not what they're using. I did look through some of the metals data, but I don't recall that amount being discussed. Frankly, I was looking at the PFAS side of things, so I'm not sure if that's the amount they talked about.
Any thoughts from the other panelists? Do you have another question, Laura?
I do. I find it interesting that we keep saying that it is safe for the player, but yet no research has been conducted. And I'm just curious about how you intend to assess that. I think that's a really important.
The data that's available indicates that the PFAS that's coming off the field, if you do these laboratory tests, which are pretty stringent, are at similar levels to what we see in soil. And so we know that soil is actually going to be more bioavailable than turf, right? Because, the PFAS that's in soil is more bioavailable in turf. There's more ability to absorb it from the soil. And we have standards for soil, and the concentrations that are in the turf are well below the soil concentrations.
But is the intention to test this on human subjects and to do research?
You can't do that.
You can't research the impact that people have had or just anecdotally collect that information?
There are epidemiological studies on PFAS exposure from people who have been exposed to much higher concentrations than what you're talking about in turf. And we do know that PFAS is toxic at these much, much higher concentrations. But you can't you can't do human studies.
Well, I'm talking anecdotally, I'm not saying subject, but it just seems that how can you determine that there is a safe level when there are no studies to back that up?
Well, what the studies that have been done that were used to determine the adsorption concentrations from soil that DEP is in the process of promulgating is based on taking those specific PFAS and in essence applying them dermally to an animal and monitoring what the results are, so that the risk of exposure to that particular PFAS has been studied from a dermal contact, and that's where that number of 300 has come from. And what we see in the turf, by the testing analyses that they've used, it's in the 0.4 to 0.5 concentration. So they haven't taken turf and applied it to, say, a mouse, which is how they do these studies, and applied turf to an animal and tested it, but they've taken the particular individual compounds and done that. That's how they've extrapolated this concentration.
Right, and they extrapolate the concentration by applying very conservative uncertainty factors. So if you see a toxic effect at X concentration, then they decrease it a number of times before they come up with any kind of standard. So the standards that they create are extremely protective.
I would raise a question. Our firefighters have had exposure to PFAS through their turnout gear. Is that comparable?
Absolutely not.
They're not practicing 7 days a year.
Right. My understanding of the concentrations in the turnout gear is orders of magnitude higher than the dermal concentrations that we're talking about. It's not in the 300 part per billion range. It's hundreds to thousands of times higher. And you're right, their exposure isn't falling on the turf or getting some dirt on them. Their exposure is sweat and operations and water and things directly on them, which is, again, from the exposure and risk standpoint, a much different scenario. But my understanding from the turnout gear is that we're looking at much, much higher concentrations that was included in that gear.
Do we have any comments from this side?
Yeah, that study did have much higher levels in the turnout gear than what you'll observe on the turf grass. But it is, again, an example of a polymer that was told safe, safe, safe. And it's not safe. There are things that come along with the polymers that we can only barely measure. But the turnout gear is, I think, again, the AFFF, the firefighting foam, is also more serious risk to the island than anything else. But just because something else is worse doesn't mean that this is perfectly safe, is what I would say is precautionary. I do think the firefighters have the worst stick of it all. They weren't told about any of this, and they're wearing it. They're changing that very rapidly, as you know. Thanks to Nantucket, the fire services there actually led the nation. It's impressive.
Courtney Kerrigan, did you have your hand up?
I did. I do have to go. So I just wanted to make a few remarks before I go. So first, I wanted to share with you all that I actually began my career as a consultant. I used to work as a paid consultant for hazardous waste sites, like the two people who are with us today. I went back to school and got my PhD at Boston University School of Public Health and Environmental Health. I did a postdoc at Dartmouth and then at Harvard. And now I'm at Michigan State University. So my expertise is in exposure science, toxicology, epidemiology, and risk assessment. I've been working in this field for almost 20 years. When I was doing my postdoc, I was actually living in Portsmouth, and I was providing technical assistance to the community there, which had one of the first detections of PFAS in drinking water in New England. And so when the turf issue came up, I thought it was kind of a slam dunk that, you know, I connected them with the Turi resources. There was some rumors of PFAS being in artificial turf. I thought that I didn't have to show up at those meetings, and that they wouldn't put the turf fields in. So I was really surprised when they did do that. So that's why I'm showing up at this meeting today. I want to point out again those data gaps, that we're missing a lot of PFASs in these assessments. That incidental dust ingestion, so the PFAS can come off potentially into the environment and then could be sticking to the balls or things, and everybody ingests a little bit of dust every day. It's not clear to me that that pathway has been assessed. Certainly hasn't been assessed considering all PFASs. And the dermal absorption route sounds like it has not been fully assessed to me. So I think that there's a lot of data gaps that need to be considered. You do have a panel of experts here joining you remotely that are not paid to work on the specific question and have volunteered their time, and they're sharing unbiased data and urging you to be precautious. So I just wanted to highlight that again before I go, and wish you luck with your decision. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Roberto, as head of the Board of Health, do you have any comments? I'll throw a hot potato right in your lap.
And I'll throw it right back. I don't have any comments right now.
Mark, Willie?
No further questions.
Okay. Any other questions?
No, I'm good.
oh, God, sorry about that. I have a question. Lord, this is a hot mic. We keep talking about the fields, the playing fields. What's the track made of?
The track, there is a proposed eight lane
What is it?
track.
What is it made of? What is it? Is there PFAS in the track too?
It's ground rubber, I believe.
The track is made out of, it's a series of, it's essentially a paved road, asphalt base to it. The half-inch, 13-millimeter surface, that top wearing surface is a plant-based polyurethane mixture with EPDM rubber, and then topped with EPDM rubber.
Thank you.
That's not a good question. Any other questions along here? Any answers from the folks on the screen? Any further thoughts?
I have two things I just wanted to mention. One is with regard to the safety studies, and I know this doesn't have to do with PFAS, but there has been a fairly recent study about injuries, a particular torque, the way people's feet slide on the turf, which makes it very difficult and is worse for injuries. But one thing I want to point out is that the women's soccer league that in the world have sued actually because the women's teams are playing on artificial turf and injuries are so bad that they want to go to natural grass. The men play on grass, they play on artificial turf. They're trying to sue to get out of that. Also, a lot of the NFL fields are trying to go back to natural grass because of the injury issue. And the article that I just read from Europe recently that talked about how much of the microplastics come off, and we have videos that show that here in the US about how these microplastics break off. Apparently, part of the reason that injuries happen on these turf fields are that those little pieces of microplastic clog the drainage and make it very hard and compact into the ground, which makes it injuries worse. So I'd be happy to send over those articles that I found as well. But then the last point that I want to make is obviously we're concerned about the impact to the athletes that are playing on these fields. But the larger issue that you always have to keep in mind is the fact that you are on a sole source aquifer. So it's not just the athletes and what they're being exposed to. What I'm primarily concerned about is the fact that this stuff is going to leach into your groundwater, into your drinking water, and it will contaminate the entire island. You're on a sole source aquifer, and adding PFAS to that sole source aquifer is a real problem. So it goes beyond what the athletes are going to be experiencing to the entire community. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, just a couple points I'd like to circle back on. Regarding synthetic turf, I think it's very important that everyone understand there are many, many different types of synthetic turf. In terms of the system is made up of drainage stone and potentially a shock attenuation pad, a geotextile fabric that served as a backing for the weaving of the turf, which has many different varieties in terms of intensity, heights, stitch gauge, and we've certainly made reference to the infill component, which we are proposing here as a Brock fill, which is harvested southern yellow pine trees from northern Georgia. Nothing is added to them. We're not proposing SBR rubber that is so commonly, has been so commonly used in the industry. What I'm getting at is there's so many different types of synthetic turf systems that have direct impact on their performance. So we measure one of the things regarding, well, they're specified to have a minimum of 8 inches of drainage per hour. So 8 inches or 8-inch rainstorm drains through that field. That is, it's a very high performing vertically draining system. But the point is also with this drainage and with the field, there are the other characteristics of synthetic turf, particularly one being rotational resistance. When we shorten that pile height and tighten the stitch gauge, we're risking a higher rotational resistance factor than we want. So my point is the fields here that we are proposing are some that are deliberately designed to be multi-purpose, high performance, and as safe a field as possible for a high school athlete playing these sports. The other last item, I do want to double back to recycling because the industry is changing. The factory, we've talked directly with the president of Rematch. The factory construction is starting next month. It is opening in Q1 of 23 with a capacity of 250 fields a year. There are more plants being proposed across the states, more plants being proposed in Europe. And I think one of the most interesting things when they talk about what you repurpose when you recycle the turf, how can it be repurposed? The plant, when that field comes into the plant, it is tagged and identified because before any recycling happens, the plant has to know exactly what that turf is, what the infill is, all those components so that they can then, once they have that laboratory test, they can then decide how they repurpose the turf. Sometimes the turf can be repurposed for turf. Other times it can't be, depending upon the composition. My point is there's a technology here that the industry, we're so glad to see, it has finally responded. And again, this plant will be open in Q1 of 23.
I see a lot of repurposed turf as putting greens. And you have exposure of these elements in people's backyards. The second thing is you talk about this plant as if it's built, and it isn't. And I could wish that we could repurpose this, but I don't believe it until I see it. Well, quite frankly. Dick, I'll give you they're probably moving ahead with it, but I have one more question. What about the biologic life underneath the turf? The worms, et cetera, the little creatures that we're going to cover up forever.
Well,
we're making a biologic desert down there, right?
I'm not sure I'd characterize it as a biological desert. I'm not sure what would live in the base stone and in the subsoil below it. The construction is you bring in approximately 8 inches of stone underneath the road. Is there biologic life underneath every town road in Nantucket? I'm not an expert on that. I don't know. Because it's really no different than that. It's disturbing the top surface, which in comparison to a road where a bituminous pavement will be more effective at sealing off the drainage, synthetic turf will not. We want that water infiltrating in right the spot that the rain falls.
And how many acres do these two proposed fields take up?
These two fields total approximately just under 200,000 square feet.
I'm
So
bad in math. How many
about
acres?
just under 5 acres.
Any questions? Questions?
No.
Okay, Pauline?
It's not a question, but it's more of a comment that I think it's important for our community to recognize this conversation on the master plan is something that has been happening for 10 years at least. And so tonight was specifically about the PFAS in the soil and also in the turf. But it is something that we will continue to discuss, whether we go one way or the other as far as the fields are concerned. It is something that we still want to consider discussing the track and the complex, because it is something that I believe our, community, and it's been what we have discussed as a school committee. I would like just to put one piece away for a thought. I was contacted and asked if teacher housing was attached to whether we got turf fields, and it is absolutely not connected to any teacher housing. So there is no requirement or pressure for anybody to feel like they have to vote for this because it would increase the chances of teacher housing. And I think that's an important piece, because that's from what I have researched. So, but we will continue this, and this has been extremely informative.
Roberto has some
Okay.
comments.
Just one last question for the experts on the field here. Have there been any studies on bioaccumulation of PFAS through these trace runoff?
With respect to the PFAS that have been studied, most, if not all, have the potential for bioaccumulation because they are persistent. So that the toxicity and the other concerns associated with PFAS are largely associated with their persistence. That is, they don't break down in the environment, they stay around for a long time, and because they stay in the environment, they can get taken up by living organisms. There's different bioaccumulation depending on the type of PFAS, but most that have been studied have the potential to bioaccumulate.
Curious about it. We have a lot of hunters, and a human is an apex predator. So I was just curious about the bioaccumulation through the animals that we eat. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for not throwing things at me. I'm relatively godlike, but I only arrange the meeting, and I hope we all learned something from this. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
I'd like to motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye. Let's see some of the questions. Sorry.
There's one of them.